On behalf of the board of the American Ethnological Association, I'm thrilled to award the honorable mention for the 2016 AES Senior Book Prize to Marc Sommers, author of The Outcast Majority: War, Development, and Youth in Africa, published in 2015 by the University of Georgia Press. The Outcast Majority is continental in scope and draws on a massive amount of documentary material and extensive in-depth interviews with war-affected youth in many countries, among them Sierra Leone, Liberia, Rwanda, and Burundi. It sheds new light on problems of development and underdevelopment, war and peace, gender and generation, social exclusion, and rural, urban, and international migration. Written in refreshingly lucid prose, The Outcast Majority vividly portrays how people endure traumas of war and its aftermath. So The Outcast Majority is a powerful manifesto for youth inclusion and for rethinking development doctrine and practices from top to bottom. It is also a model of how ethnographic research can tackle the largest and most meaningful problems, report findings in accessible language, and suggest compelling policy alternatives. Professor Sommers could not be here today with us, but he is because he's in South Africa at a conference on youth. I'm delighted, however, that his sister, Cecily Sommers, who lives in Minneapolis, is here and will accept the honorable mention on his behalf.
Dear AES members, and especially members of the board of the American Ethnological Society, my name is Cecily Sommers, and on behalf of my brother Marc Sommers, I am delighted to accept this honorable mention for your Senior Book Prize. Marc is very disappointed that he cannot be here in person, as he's currently just returning from South Africa. After presenting at an international conference on youth and peace building, he's asked me to be here to accept this honor on his behalf. Marc has asked me to share with you the reasons he wrote The Outcast Majority. Quote, first, some background. After conducting research on the impact of war on young people for over 2 decades, it was clear that the development response to their needs too often veered between inadequate and beside the point. In response, I came up with a plan to transform my frustration about the youth and development mismatch into a book that would do 3 things. 1, highlight the voices and experiences of war-affected young Africans. 2, reveal the bevy of constraints on international development efforts. And 3, propose a framework for making development work far more inclusive and relevant. The result was The Outcast Majority. Thus far, it's attracted a great deal of attention, particularly from development practitioners. I think I know why. Faced with absolutely colossal youth populations, and not just in countries affected by war, governments and development agencies aren't really sure what to do. Many officials also are unnerved by an uncomplicated and inaccurate idea that male youth citizens somehow threaten their own societies. This notion has an equally devastating corollary. Female youth effectively are ignorable. My hope for The Outcast Majority is that it will help turn unease about young Africans, both female and male youth, into positive appreciation for just how determined and inspiring Africa's youth really are. Not even war can keep them down or hold them back, and they share this unsinkable spirit with young people all over the world. More broadly, I hope readers, whether they work for a government or a development agency, or if they are professors, students, journalists, or simply are interested in young people in Africa, find the book enlightening and useful." End quote. Marc has asked me to express particular thanks to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for providing him with the opportunity to get writing and research for The Outcast Majority well underway. He also wanted me to thank a note of thanks to his wife, Leslie Ann Long, for her bountiful support and editorial brilliance. Marc also is indebted to the contributions of many others who provided excellent comments and insights as he worked to complete The Outcast Majority. As his sister, I am proud to have had an opportunity to play a part in the production of this engaging and potentially groundbreaking book. Finally, but most definitely not least, Marc asked me to share his heartfelt thanks to your society for recognizing the Outcast majority for honorable mention for your Senior Book Prize. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Board of the American Ethnological Society, it gives me great pleasure to award this year's AES Senior Book Prize to Tania Murray Li, author of Land's End, Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier, which was published by Duke University Press in 2014. I'm especially delighted that Professor Li can be here with us today because originally she wasn't planning on coming to the AAA meetings since she has another trip coming up next week when she will go to Vancouver to be formally inducted into the Royal Society of Canada. So double congratulations are clearly in order. It's nice to have at least some good news this week. Land's End is a powerful, poignant, longitudinal ethnographic study of how Laogai highlanders on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi embraced cash cropping, privatized their commons, and set in motion new and largely unanticipated processes of class differentiation, social exclusion, exploitation, and migration. Tragically, it was not corporate land grabbers or the Indonesian state that initiated these shifts, but rather the highlanders themselves, who dreamed of a better life and hoped to enter their imagined version of modernity. Land's End is a compelling critique of both conventional development prescriptions that see market relations as a panacea for rural poverty, and of social movements that stress indigenous rights, environmental protection, and food sovereignty, but that fail to address the needs of or even to see vulnerable groups which don't fit their preconceived notions of indigeneity or peasantness. There's a lot more that could be said about this outstanding book, but we're going to proceed in a few minutes to an extended conversation with the author, so I think I'll save my comments for that. Before awarding the prize to Professor Li, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the collaboration and hard work of the other members of the Book Prize Committee, Elizabeth Ferry, Tina Gameltoft, and co-chair Shalina Shankar. Also, without detracting in the least from the recognition that AES has accorded Professor Li, I want to express my appreciation to all of the authors who submitted over 30 books, nearly 40 books actually, for our consideration. There were so many outstanding books that we committee members were frequently torn and wanted to grant recognition to many of them. Serving on this prize committee allowed us to benefit from a wonderful immersion course and the latest anthropological writing. So, Tania Murray Li, the American Ethnological Society is very pleased to award you its 2016 Senior Book Prize. Congratulations.
Thank you so much for coming in person. Can we start by having you tell us about why you decided to write this particular book?
Okay. So I had a very specific, I think because it's not my first book, I think at this stage of the game you kind of have a specific idea of what you want to accomplish with a book. And I had this material, and really one of the main things I wanted to try to do was to see whether I could write something which would bridge some solitudes. I think kind of culture and political economy haven't always come into a happy alignment, although I think they could, and that was something I wanted to try to do with this book. I think also agrarian studies and anthropology. You know, anthropology used to be the home of studies of rural people, peasant villages, and so on, but I think it has been fairly absent from those rural scenes for some decades now. So I wanted to see, could I write an ethnography which would reinsert agrarian debates into the heart of anthropology, but also conversely show people in agrarian studies what an ethnography can do? Like, why would you value this type of data, this type of insight? You know, why is it worth spending so much time in one place, kind of patiently trying to tease out what was going on there? So that was really why I wrote this book in this voice.
Thank you.
One of the things that I found particularly fascinating about the book is that it's a longitudinal study over a couple of decades, and that it wasn't the typical anthropological restudy where you went somewhere for a year plus as a graduate student and then returned there because you always loved that place. The ethnography is based on many relatively short visits over a period of some 20 years. And I was wondering if you could comment on the methodological implications of that. And one of the things that was especially striking for me is that if you had done the classic one-year ethnography, you would have missed all of the processes that you were describing.
Yes, I know. Well, it's interesting because I think so many people are now in touch with their field sites over long periods, and that's often because they can use, phone and other media. So that wasn't actually the case here because there's still no electricity and people still don't really have phones or any other media. So it did involve kind of physically revisiting. But the disadvantage, you asked me the sort of pros and cons. I mean, the struggle is how do you get sufficient intensity? How do you get to know people well enough if you're just there for a month or 6 weeks and then you take off and you show up again a year later or 2 years later, something like that. So that's definitely challenging. And of course, if it had been my original field site, it would have been a follow-up, but it wasn't, right? I started this on a postdoc. The longest time I ever spent there was 12 weeks. The shortest time was 2 weeks. In total, I think 11 visits, about a year, spread over 20. So that has the disadvantage, that it could be thin. To try to guard against that, I had very specific techniques. Each time I went back, I would reread all my field notes from the time before, and I kept file cards on people, on events that I wanted to follow up, so that I felt like I can't start again from the beginning. I actually have to build cumulatively. But that took quite a bit of work in between visits to remind myself, who was who, what were the names of the kids, like who am I going to talk to, what were the brewing events 2 years ago that I want to see what happened next. So that's something that, you can get that intensity, but you have to be quite, well, I found I had to be quite deliberate about it. I think one thing that really struck me was if I had started, or if you went there now, one of you, having read nothing that I'd written, and tried to, we kid ourselves we can do oral history, right? If you tried to reconstruct the land and agrarian relations of 1990 based on conversations with people today, I really doubt that you could do it. It's really made me realize how, having been there at the time, and so knowing the vocabulary, knowing the right things to ask about, knowing the events and so on, I could reconstruct it, but then I knew all the clues, and I think somebody who is, it's made me very aware when I'm in new field sites and I'm thinking, I can ask people about the past and I can find out about the past. I mean, you can find out some things, but definitely the tracking over time is a very distinctive kind of information.
Great. I'd love to follow up on that through this question that came up for me about how you conceive of I guess what some ethnographers may still call community. You use the term neighborhoods, which I thought was a really dynamic formulation because it allowed you to stress the fluidity of language and kinship. And it seemed to work quite well in the book, but I wondered, since we had you here, if you could remark further in terms of scale, how you think what neighborhood offered that community didn't, and also were there any pitfalls that you didn't reveal in the book that you might share with us as we think about new ways of thinking about how to conceive of populations?
Yes. Well, the field site described in the book is rather like the one Anna Singh describes in Realm of a Diamond Queen, very similar in the sense that she said she started walking and she never knew when she had arrived because there were no concentrated hamlets. So community or neighborhood isn't just there as a physical concentrated settlement. So that's a feature of these kinds of landscapes. And maybe it's not that unusual. So we often just use like the village or the concentrated settlement as the obvious unit of analysis. But where that doesn't exist, you have to figure out what is your unit of analysis. And initially, in fact, right to the end, there were about 10 different neighborhoods that I used to visit on each revisit to see what had been going on. When I actually came to write the book, though, I wrote most of it about one place, and that was because that was the place where I had more density, where I knew people better. I actually could place people in their kinship networks. I knew how they were related to each other. I knew the rise and fall of their families. And so that's something which, a concentration of people gives you, which kind of tracking individuals or tracking random hamlets cannot give you. So to return to the kind of community, I mean, in the term community, that's a very loaded term, right? There's all kinds of assumptions about kind of commonality. Mm-hmm. Neighborhood for them is an emic term. That's what they call it, like the people congregated in one place or who live in proximity. So for them, it doesn't have any other specific weight except that those are the people who are around about. And so then the question of what kinds of relations you construct with those people is part of the dynamic you have to study. You can't assume it as your starting point. You have to figure out, well, what is the obligation of neighborhood? If you live close to someone, what does that mean in terms of the kinds of relations you'll have with them? So, yeah, I think it was sort of, built from the ground up, really.
Yeah, thank you.
The processes of class differentiation that you analyze in the book are very bound up with the decision that people took to plant cacao, or cocoa, as some people say. I've just come from Ecuador, where they call it cacao. Mm. It would be interesting to hear you say a little bit about what they thought they were doing when they made the decision to plant this permanent tree crop. And also, if you could say a little bit about the material characteristics of cacao itself. One of them that comes up in your book, and I thought this was quite interesting, is that cacao is notoriously vulnerable to disease, and that has really been its undoing in many cacao growing regions in the world. And if cacao is an ephemeral crop in this region, what will come after? And is it possible to reverse these changes that occurred as a result of its cultivation?
Well, I think it came up in a previous person's remarks as well. What people thought they were doing was making a claim on modernity. They thought that this was a way in which they could increase their economic well-being, stabilize their production, stabilize their hamlets as well. And there is a long history of this in Indonesia. I think the other half, we've read Geertz on agricultural involution, where the focus is on Java, shared poverty, stagnation. But the other half of the book is on what I call involution's dynamic others, which is these people in outlying areas who have, for more than a century, been very entrepreneurial. These are indigenous highland people living on a land frontier who have abundant land resources. And when a new crop comes along, which seems to have promise, and everybody's getting into it, you have a crop boom. So this fell, it happened to be cocoa, but it fell into a pattern of other crop booms which used to terrify colonial officials. And Geertz also writes about this, right? The colonials always thought that the indigenous population should grow food. And they thought, well, but if we're going to make more money from coffee or rubber or whatever is the boom crop of the time, who are you to tell us that we should not do these things? We should not try these things. So I think it's not really about, the specificity of cacao is that it's very disease prone. So the downside of that is that you have to be serious about growing it. You have to actually be, you could say, thinking like a capitalist, in the sense that you have to save money to shower agricultural chemicals on your cocoa. Otherwise, after 7 years, production is zero. So it's an unforgiving crop for the half-hearted smallholder. But its main feature is that it's a perennial. And so that has definitive effects. You asked about, after the cocoa's dead, could things go back? And you also asked me about path dependence. But I think that's the definitive thing. Once you've planted a perennial, you've effectively privatized the land. And in all the indigenous systems of Southeast Asia, it's the same. Tree planting is understood to be a permanent privatization of the commons. And so it was the fact that it was a perennial, not that it was cocoa, that actually changed everything. I don't think you can go back on that. I think that is a path dependence. I would be very surprised. I think that you can change to a different crop, but now that the land has become individual private property and has in fact become fantastically unequally owned as well, I don't think you can turn the clock back on that set of social relations. I think it is definitive.
Sorry, please excuse me. I have to give a paper
Yeah.
on another
Yeah.
panel, but please continue.
I'd like to ask you about the label Indigenous. It figures in your subtitle. If I'm not mistaken, there isn't really an equivalent of the term in Bahasa Indonesia language. Why do you feel that that's an appropriate term for the people that you studied? And do they have a self-ascribed label that resembles our Indigenous?
They don't, because I think our label Indigenous is the product of a kind of transnational articulation, which has arrived at this term and given it certain kinds of meaning and significance. But their term for themselves is the people of the mountains, the people of the headwaters, and they certainly think they are indigenous in the sense that they do not think they came from anywhere else. Their ancestors are the first people of the world, born from a clump of bamboo on the top of one of these mountains. Like, they see themselves as first people in that sense. They have no history of themselves as being migrants or from elsewhere. So they see themselves as original to that place. In fact, as is common with many indigenous people, they think they're the first people of the world and that all the people of the world descend from them. People went to the north and south and the east and the west and uphill and down. So that's an indigenous worldview, I would say. Do they fit with the terms of the movement? That's a problem, because the movement in Indonesia anyway has been stuck on this idea that the essence of indigeneity is holding land under communal and inalienable, on a communal and inalienable basis. They've chosen to regard that as the definition of indigeneity. So to the extent that people have mixed tenure regimes, which have some communal and some private elements, or emphasize private elements, they're an awkward fit with the movement as it has been defined. So it's an ongoing conversation. People in the Indonesian indigenous movement who have read the book are horrified by it, because it seems to suggest that they're positing of indigenous people as the other of capitalism, the other of commodification, the other of the market. Doesn't really hold with perspectives from below. But I think they could handle that just by broadening the movement and recognizing the dynamic, entrepreneurial, indigenous subject as well.
Tania, I wish we could go on discussing all afternoon, but I've been informed that our time is up.
Okay.
So I want to thank you so much again for coming here, congratulate you again for this wonderful book.
Thank you.
On behalf of AES. So it's been a delight. Thank you.
Thank you.